Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Another high-stakes political showdown in Washington. Congressional Republicans have passed a bill raising the debt ceiling, and that bill includes spending cuts. The president's response? No way.
Well, no surprise. Senate Democrats are also rejecting the House plan. Jenna Browder brings us this look at the bill and the calls for the president to come to the table.
This is a big moment for Republicans and especially House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who was able to pull off the passage of this bill with the thinnest of margins.
Yeas are 217, the nays are 215. The bill is passed.
The House moving late Wednesday afternoon to pass the sweeping legislation.
We passed this early. We are in April, way ahead of the debt limit. We are the only party to take fiscal action in a sound mind that would lift the debt limit so we wouldn't have economic damage.
The plan would raise the government's debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion until March of next year, in exchange for spending cuts amounting to $4.5 trillion. It would limit federal spending, allowing federal discretionary spending to increase by only 1% annually in the years ahead. The plan would also recover unused COVID relief money. It would target the IRS and rescind nearly $71 billion from the agency, and block student loan relief, repealing President Biden's move to waive $10,000 to $20,000 for nearly all borrowers. Republicans are blaming the president and Capitol Hill Democrats for America's economic problems.
Under the effects of the $10 trillion in spending over the last 2 years, $6 trillion added to the national debt, record inflation, soaring interest rates, and a nosedive into recession.
In turn, Democrats attacking the GOP for a possible downturn ahead.
Every minute wasted on Speaker McCarthy's empty gesture is a minute we get closer to default and Republican-manufactured recession.
The Democrat-controlled Senate is not expected to take up the bill.
Let me be clear. Democrats cannot and will not, for the sake of America and its families, allow Republicans' DOA Act to ever become law.
In an interview with CBN's Faith Wire, Senator Tim Scott says Washington is going to have to figure out how to rein in more spending.
There's no family in the country who would intentionally, albeit some do, but who would intentionally spend more money than you're bringing in for 40 years in a row.
Now all eyes are on the president, saying he wants to increase the debt ceiling, but refusing to negotiate.
They haven't figured out the debt limit yet. Happy to meet with McCarthy, but not on whether or not the debt limit gets extended. That's not negotiable.
And so we would really like it. It'd be a lot easier if President Biden was sitting at the table with the speaker saying, okay, let's come up with ideas of how to solve this problem.
It's untenable for President Biden to say, I'm not going to negotiate on a debt ceiling. That's absurd. He was the prime negotiator assigned from President Obama when he was vice president to negotiate the debt ceiling in 2011.
House Republicans say they've done their part to pass a measure that would lift the debt ceiling. The focus is now on Senate Democrats and President Biden to see how they respond. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Well, behind all the politics here, and there seems to be a great deal of politics and campaigning for 2024, when we just have to pass a budget in 2023. So what's the budget, and how much federal deficit spending are we going to allow? And it's absolutely true. We have run up a bill that our grandchildren aren't even going to be able to pay. When you look at $30 trillion, how in the world do you ever pay that off? And the policymakers over the past 40 years have resolved, well, we won't ever have to pay it off, or it won't happen in our lifetime to get it paid off. Well, that creates long-term problems. I keep going back to a Bank of America study. It was done 20 years ago. That if we don't rein in federal spending, if we allow the federal deficit to keep on accumulating, at some point in time, the interest rate on that debt is going, the amount of money that you and I as taxpayers have to pay just on the interest on the debt is going to exceed what we spend in national defense. When it hits that point, you can get rid of all discretionary spending, all of it, and still not have a balanced budget. That ought to scare everybody. It certainly ought to scare everybody in an elected office, regardless of party. So at what point do we say fiscal responsibility needs to be the order of the day? We need to protect our children and our grandchildren, but more importantly, can we at least protect ourselves and our currency right now so that we're not continuing this reckless spending? If we can possibly come to agreement over that, well, then there is hope for our children and our grandchildren. If we can't, well, then I don't think there's much hope for any of us, because at some point the bill gets so large you can't possibly even pay the interest. In other news, a volatile hearing in Congress over the COVID lockdowns in public schools. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Gordon, Randy Weingarten, the head of the second largest teachers union, told lawmakers they didn't have inappropriate influence on the incoming Biden administration in keeping schools closed during the pandemic. But congressional Republicans disagreed, pointing to evidence they say shows COVID was not a threat to children.
On July 20th, 2020, Swedish and Finnish public health agencies issued a public report comparing the two countries, concluding that closure or not of schools has little, if any, impact on the number of laboratory-confirmed cases in school-age children.
Critics have blasted the union for providing guidance to the CDC that played a part in keeping schools closed, saying it hurt students' grades and created a mental health crisis. Well, turning to Israel, where Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is in Jerusalem on a foreign policy trip ahead of an expected presidential run. He spoke of the importance of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, saying America must work with Israel and support its right to self-defense. He said Florida had successfully fought the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against the Jewish state, and added that the United States policy should recognize that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel.
We must also ensure that, however the future political winds may blow, the U.S. Embassy will always be right here in Jerusalem. That's never going to change.
And as Israel celebrates its 75th anniversary this week, one key leader is already looking decades ahead to focus on how the nation can prepare for its 100th. CBN's Chris Mitchell brings us that story from Jerusalem.
Former Knesset member and Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, recently introduced his latest book, 2048, The Rejuvenated State. Oren hopes the book will encourage a conversation or debate like the one that took place prior to the state's birth in 1948.
Before this country was created, there were 60 years between 1880s and 1940s where Jewish thinkers around the world thought about the future of this state. And by the way, a number of Christians as well thought about whether this country would be a secular country, religious country, capitalist, communist, pro-Western, pro-Eastern. Many of those debates proved influential in ensuring Israel's success, success of our first century.
At this event, Oren explained how he wants his book to be a conversation starter for the next 25 years of Israel's future.
This is my vision. There are 21 chapters in here that cover just about every major field of Israel's future, its educational policy, social policy, foreign policy, Israel, diaspora Jews, Israel, Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, everything, gender issues, environmental issues. It's all there. And the idea is to get readers here and to a large extent in the diaspora as well to engage with my vision. Get angry at it. Throw the book at the wall. Do me a favor, but engage with it. And let us stimulate and let us facilitate a discussion on what kind of future we want for our grandchildren.
Oren says even with the challenges Israel faces, like a nuclear Iran and the current debate over judicial reform, it's important to remember how far Israel has come in 75 years.
It's one of the great stories, if not the greatest story in modern history, of a people that survives the Holocaust, 3 years later declares a state with no allies, no natural resources, 600,000 Jews in this country, and we turned around and we made a country that has an army that's more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined, 7 of the world's leading universities. Actually, one of the few countries, by the way, Chris, has never known a second of non-democratic governance, along with the United States, Britain, Canada. Just a powerhouse of a country. Extraordinary, extraordinary stories.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
An improbable story that fulfills Scripture. Gordon?
It is a wonderful story that shows what can happen when God fulfills his promise and he keeps his covenant. And that's when you look at Israel, look, this is God keeping his covenant. And the people in Israel responding to that covenant and saying, our purpose, our destiny is to be a light to the nations, to show people what can happen when God is protecting you. We used to adhere to that. We used to declare that we're a city on a hill. That was the declaration over Massachusetts in the colonial period. But President Reagan brought that back and said the entire United States should be a city on the hill. Can we return to that? Right now, we're an example of division. We're an example of what not to do in politics. Can we turn this around and say, once again, we want to be a city on a hill. We want to be a city blessed by God, a nation blessed by God, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.